Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Richard Parks, and I'd like to welcome you to LB 326B, Section 730. This is the online section, obviously, of the 19th century transformation of Western medicine. In this course, we're going to cover the events that took place in the history of medicine over the course of the 19th century that are commonly referred to as the development of the germ theory of medicine, or in other words, the way that we understand medicine today. That many illnesses are contagious and that they're spread through specific agents like bacteria and viruses. We will trace the development of this new theory from the beginning of the 19th century, when bloodletting was still the most common cure offered to heal the sick, to the end of the 19th century, by which time modern hospitals had emerged, with such features as x-rays, surgery under anesthesia, and widespread vaccination. The changes that occurred over the course of the 19th century are truly mind-boggling. We're going to study the transformation of Western medicine and the eventual acceptance of the germ theory by looking at two important 19th century diseases, cholera and tuberculosis. But before we get to our story about the transformations that took place in the 19th century, we need to understand how medical professionals and the common people viewed sickness and health in the time period prior to the 19th century. And in our slide here, we see a barber surgeon curing a patient through bloodletting, which was a common cure prior to the 19th century. And we see a doctor pulling a rotten tooth, and we see him advertising the fact that he knows how to do this by wearing a necklace made out of teeth. For almost 2 millennia, the view of the human body and how the human body has worked, the physiology of the human body, and what caused illness had not changed. At the dawn of the 19th century, people still relied heavily upon what we will call Hippocratic or Galenic humoral medicine. The founding fathers of this approach were the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates, from whom we get our Hippocratic Oath, and the Roman physician Galen. The Hippocratic or Galenic approach taught that the body was a self-regulating unit, that it was part of nature. Health was idiosyncratic. In other words, health was different in each individual patient, and this health was mapped onto a very complex system called the humoral medical system. Hippocratic Galenic humoral medicine taught that all human bodies were comprised of various elements or humors. These humors were yellow bile, black bile, phlegm, and blood. Each of these humors corresponded to particular qualities in a person. So, yellow bile, hot and dry; black bile, cold and dry; phlegm, cold and wet; blood, hot and wet. These four humors are also associated with the four elements of Aristotle: earth, air, fire, and water. Each person balanced all of these humors in their body. The balance of these humors constituted good health. And as I said before, health was idiosyncratic, so each person's balance was different. What made illness was when your humors were out of balance for what was normal for your system. So if we look at the chart on our slide here, and we see in the large yellow box, we see a smiley face. This is a person who is a naturally melancholic person. This person is naturally cold and dry. And you see his little smiley face over by the earth. And the doctor knows this because he knows this patient. And he's followed this patient for a long time, and he knows his history. Well, suddenly this patient starts sweating, gets a fever, has diarrhea or vomiting. So this patient is exhibiting symptoms that are hot and wet. So that person is sort of veering over or drifting over toward air, which is an unnatural position for this patient. So the physician knows that in order to get this patient healthy, he needs to get rid of whatever is in the body that is warm and wet, which means that he's probably going to bleed the patient. Now, as he lets out blood, that patient becomes cooler and drier and drifts back towards the smiley face, which is his normal state of health. Therapeutics, or the way to cure the patient, relied upon rebalancing the humors in the body back to what would be normal for that particular individual. So, if you were normally a cold, dry, melancholic person and you showed symptoms of a fever, sweating, vomiting, your physician would try to get you back to your normal humoral balance. The fever and excretions meant that you have too much hot and wet in your body. In order to get you back to your normal state, which is cold and dry, the physician would want to remove hot and wet from your body. This would be done by bleeding the patient. Most medical interventions involved bloodletting, emetics to make the person vomit, or cathartics to make the person excrete feces. In other words, the cure was often not much better than the disease. In these images that we have on the slide, in image one, you see there leeches in a container, which would have been a way to bloodlet by putting leeches on a person. In image number two, we see kind of an interesting cure, 15th century cure for syphilis. And what you see at the edge of the slide is you see a person's head sort of sticking out of like sort of a pot or a container. Well, what they're doing there is they thought that syphilis was a cold, wet disease. And so they put the person inside this little clay oven and they basically bake them. They start a fire underneath the bottom, and the person is inside this kiln and is basically baked in hot, dry air to sort of rebalance their humors. In image three, you see a barber surgeon doing bloodletting. And in image four, you see somebody operating probably either for an anal fistula, or it could be that they are actually removing a bladder stone. To remove bladder stones, they would actually go in through the anus and cut a hole into the bladder through the anus and then reach their hand in and pull out the bladder stone. So you can imagine if you survived the surgery, chances are you probably wouldn't survive the infection. Through the centuries, this Galenic humoral system was overlaid with references to planetary charts, zodiac signs, and local natural phenomena like heat waves, earthquakes, or floods. The complexity of the Galenic system meant that only a university-trained philosopher-physician could diagnose and rebalance the humors of the ailing individual. And in these pictures we see on our slide here, we see common astrological symbols that we still recognize today and how they're associated with certain parts of the body. In the center slide there, you see a person who has syphilis. And what this picture is showing you is the belief that syphilis is actually caused by a malevolent alignment of the planets of Mars and Saturn. And when Mars and Saturn have aligned in the heavens, they've sort of emanated their rays down on people and caused them to get this illness that a philosopher physician will need to intervene in and rebalance their humors. Now, as we've been discussing, Galenic humoral medicine is a system of belief that lasted for well over 2,000 years. But that doesn't mean that there were times along the way that it wasn't questioned, or that people started thinking about what could possibly be the chinks in the armor of this system. And let's talk about three of these challenges to the Galenic system. The first challenge is represented here on this slide, and this is the publication of De Humani Corporis Fabrica, or On the Fabric of the Human Body, or On the Structure of the Human Body, which was written by Vesalius in 1543. In this very detailed anatomical reference manual, Vesalius intricately sketched the inner workings of human physiology and anatomy. Most important was that Vesalius directly contradicted several teachings of Galenic medicine. For example, Vesalius differed with Galen on the number of bones in the skull and in the sternum. He also differed with Galen on the structure of the heart and lungs. He even realized that things that Galen claimed were in the human body, like the rete mirabile, which is a web of nerves at the base of the brain, actually only exists in sheep. In fact, many of the mistakes that Vesalius found were based upon the fact that Galen had never actually seen the interior of the human body. Human dissection was impermissible under Roman law, and Galen based most of his observations upon animal dissections, from which he then extrapolated to humans. The second challenge to Galenic medicine came with the publication of William Harvey's book De Motu Cordis, or On the Motion of the Heart, in 1628. In this groundbreaking book, Harvey postulated that the heart was actually a pump that circulated the blood within a closed circulatory system. This circulatory system somehow included the lungs and a hidden connection between the arterial system and the venous system. Of course, we understand that it's at this connecting point that the blood is exchanging carbon dioxide for oxygen to then be pumped back out to the body. Although Harvey didn't quite understand this part of the equation, he was totally correct that the heart is a pump and that the circulatory system is a closed loop. This directly contradicts Galen, who claimed that the heart only warmed the blood, and that the blood was drawn and pushed and pulled in the body by various forces, mysterious forces, that it was not pumped. Galen also did not recognize that the blood was circulating within a closed system. The final big challenge to Galenic humoral medicine were the discoveries of the chemical revolution in the 1700s. During this time period, men like Joseph Priestley and Antoine Lavoisier made important discoveries that explained combustion, isolated oxygen, and laid out a whole new way to view and name their chemical discoveries. Galenic medicine believed that there were four humors, which we've discussed, and four elements, which we've also discussed, that were named by the ancient Greek Aristotle: earth, air, fire, and water. Lavoisier claimed that there were actually many, many elements, and that these elements were substances that could not be chemically decomposed into other elements. In other words, Galen's rather simplistic view of four humors and four elements was being replaced by a very complicated system that showed that there were actually many elements. And we see an example here, vitriola venus, which would have been this very sort of elementary explanation of a chemical compound as explained by Galen. And we see that by the time we move into the 1700s or the 18th century, people understand that vitriola venus is actually copper sulfate, which is a very complex chemical compound. So to recap, The Galenic humoral medical paradigm, which had dominated for thousands of years, was now starting to see challenges. And we have talked about three of these challenges. The gross anatomy, as presented by Vesalius, the physiology of the heart and circulatory system, as presented by Harvey, and the chemical revolution, furthered by the discoveries of men like Lavoisier and Priestley. However, none of these really dismantled Galenic humoral medicine. What did finally deal the death blow to Galenic humoral medicine came at the very end of the 1700s, and this was the birth of the Paris School of Medicine. Now, in the next module, we will discuss the Paris School of Medicine and how it changed the ways in which physicians viewed and understood the human body and health and illness.